Okay, well, yeah, first of all, thanks very much to the organisers for setting this up. It's been a really fascinating afternoon. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Alasdair Grant and his book, Greek Captives and Mediterranean Slavery, 1260 to 1460. First, I should also introduce myself. I'm Mike Carr. I'm a senior lecturer in late medieval history at the University of Edinburgh. And Alasdair is currently based at the University of Hamburg and University of Mainz. And his book is really a quite substantial reworking of his PhD thesis, which was completed in Edinburgh in 2021. And as the title suggests, the book focuses on captivity and enslavement of Greeks in the Aegean region in the really sort of highly fragmented period between the Fourth Crusade and the fall of Constantinople in 1453. And he's focusing especially on the 14th century, during which there was a sort of crisis of captivity, as Alasdair puts it. And what really impressed me about this book, I mean, many things impressed me about it, but it was really the regional breadth of the analysis and the subsequent use of the source material from such diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds. So Alasdair's focusing on the enslavement of Greeks in the Romania and in the Aegean region. But by doing so, he's looking at where these people ended up all across the Mediterranean, in Iberia and northern Italy, and Cyprus, Crete, various Latin ruled territories in the east as well. So he's really sort of looking at this pan-Mediterranean network of enslavement at this particular moment. And the sources that Alasdair's used for this are not just Byzantine sources, but also copious numbers of published and unpublished notarial records from the Latin world as well, such as from the archives of Palermo, Venice, and Dubrovnik, as well as Arabic and Ottoman Turkish sources. So it's a really sort of impressive and empirical analysis of the very wide-ranging source material to put this enslavement in a sort of pan-Mediterranean context. And what Alasdair demonstrates very clearly is the breadth of the enslavement of Greek peoples at this particular point. And this is to quote from Alasdair's own conclusion, where he says, from now on, captivity should be understood as one of the characteristic experiences of late medieval Greeks, both in the Byzantine Empire and far beyond. And Alasdair does that incredibly effectively. And for that reason, I think this should be a sort of must read for scholars, not just of Byzantium, but also of medieval Mediterranean history, cross-cultural history, history of slavery, etc. So anyway, I won't waste any more of your time. I'll hand over to Alasdair. And also, I'll just mention very quickly, because Alasdair asked me to do this, that there is a discount code of 30% for this book, and I will put the discount code in the chat. So yeah, Alasdair, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Mike. And thank you very much to Petros, Lucas, and Callum for facilitating this festival. Because, as Mike said, this is basically an empirically driven work, I thought that the best way to approach this would simply be to rattle through what the book is and what it tries to demonstrate. So the introduction carries the subtitle, A Crisis of Captivity, and that's basically the red thread that runs through this book. It began, as Mike said, as a PhD thesis. The original topic was meant to be something much broader, cross-religious relations in the last centuries of Byzantium. But it turned out that captivity was enough to fill a whole thesis, and I think it was definitely the right decision. It looks at the sort of triangular relationship between Turkish raiding in the context of this fragmentation that Mike has nicely described, Latin trading, but also raiding, and not just in the Byzantine Empire, but even more so beyond the borders of the shrinking Byzantine Empire in this context of conquest after the Fourth Crusade. The source base that this work uses, Mike's already covered a bit of this, but it is mostly sort of Latin vernacular, as in Western European vernacular, and Greek sources, including a lot of archival material, some unpublished Greek manuscript material, a very small smattering of Arabic and Turkish material. There was a sample size of about 2,400 individuals, individual captives that went into this book. But if you add that to all the groups who are mentioned in sort of as mass captivities, then that number increases quite considerably. And the book's divided into three parts, which are reflected in these titles on the left-hand side of the screen. So a sort of contextual part, a social dynamics part, and then a cross-cultural part, which represents, of course, the original concern of the book. The first chapter sets up those initial contexts in 13th century, and its focus is on Asia Minor, because this is a story that really happens with the disintegration of the Byzantine Turkish frontier after a period of relative equilibrium with the Rum Seljuks that's ruptured quite suddenly in 1259-60 by Turkish expansion, which of course coincides almost exactly with the conquest of Constantinople by the Empire of Nicaea. And this is something that's shown very clearly in a sudden upswing of notarial evidence for the sale and also manumission of people with Greek names, often explicitly said to be Greek or to come from areas of the Aegean, in both Cyprus and Crete, just before and just after 1300. And of course, the Catalans are invited in to fight back the Turks on behalf of Byzantium, but they end up taking captives themselves. And so by 1300, what we find is that the full roster of these actors, the Turks, the Venetians, the Genoese, the Catalans, they're all present in the Aegean region. The second chapter was a sort of extra chapter that wasn't in the initial thesis, aimed to set up the wider contexts. How does this Aegean trade fit into the trans-Mediterranean context? The first thing to note is a sort of methodological point that the trafficking of Greeks is not the same thing as the slave trade within the Byzantine Empire. So one is about Byzantine traders and slave owners as actors. One is about people who come from the Aegean region, have Greek names, or are said to be Greeks in Latin sources, who are victims of these slave trading activities. And this is outlined in what I identify as two essentially complementary, but basically in terms of their origins, quite separate slave trades. An interesting thing that I found out during writing this chapter is the fact that Venice seems to enslave Greeks en masse, but Genoa does not, because of what I perceive to be its much closer diplomatic relations with Byzantium and its much more important presence in the Black Sea. And while Byzantium trades with the Mamluks, what's also interesting perhaps is that very few Greeks actually seem to end up enslaved by the Mamluks, which may be perhaps because they escape to Cyprus. Then in the second part, I first of all focus on defining what these terms captives and slaves might actually mean, and mixing in a third term, refugee. This is to do with the Greek vocabulary of captivity, echmalatos, and the attempts that I'm making to try to distinguish between different statuses. So enslavement is at its most basic, a kind of habituation of captivity. So for example, somebody gets sold, or somebody simply ends up as a captive for a very long time and therefore eventually becomes accepted as having a different status. But of course, the distinction is often very muddy, and we have to distinguish between terms in the sources and what we as scholars might want to use as categories to describe these people. Of course, the degree of wealth or fame of the individual who's captured is going to influence the prices and the stakes of any ransoming activities, but the vast majority of the people I'm looking at in this book are people who don't occur anywhere else in the written records. They come up once as a captured individual. They're probably of fairly low social status. If we look far to the west of the Mediterranean, we can see quite good evidence of the sort of lives that these people actually had under artisans, often as owners, often working in sort of doing manual labor for their own release, and perhaps having longer enslavement terms than in the central Mediterranean. Echmalatos sometimes means refugee in texts, but this may also reflect the fact that captives are often seen to be very mobile, which is something I'll come on to on the next slide. And when we find these people as refugees, and this comes back to a comment that I think Nicholas Morton made, they actually seem to opt more often for Latin-ruled territories than for Byzantine or Turkish as a place to find refuge. In terms of methods of redemption, this was actually the original kernel of the project, on the basis of these alms-seeking testimonials, and something that my primary supervisor Neil Scow very kindly made me aware of, and something that I hope will be published in full in a proper edition soon. So this comes from the importance of ransom as a religious duty among all three monotheistic religions, and also thinking of Ahmet's talk, it's also one of it's basically the only thing that justifies the alienation of church property, especially silver. And this is a world in which Byzantine institutions are retreating in conquered territories, and so their individuals are having to facilitate their own ransoms. We don't see the sort of prisoner exchanges that are the feature of the Central Middle Ages, the sort of, well, even let's say the early to late Middle Byzantine period. And we also don't really see so much activity by the Redemptorist military orders, which is a feature of Spain or southern France. In the final of the three parts, I consider what effect this had on cross-cultural relations. First of all, thinking about the Byzantines or the Greek Christians and their Latin Christian neighbors. First of all, of course, religion is the key justifying factor of medieval slavery. If you're of a different religious group, then your enslavement is perceived as justified. But over the late Middle Ages, this becomes increasingly inadequate for a number of reasons that I'll come on to in a second. The Latins, of course, question the validity of the Greeks' Christianity because they're perceived as schismatic, and efforts to reunite the churches periodically change that picture. But Roman law, of course, demands that slaves are taxonomized by ethnicity and not by religion, which means that there's also an element in which, yes, it matters if you're perceived to be religiously the same or different, but it also matters which group you belong to. And it seems to me that if you could prove that you were a Greek in terms of your ethnicity and that you accepted Latin Christianity, you had among perhaps all groups enslaved by Latin Christians the best chances of manumission, far better than other non-Latin Christians. But of course, because quite a lot of Greek-speaking Christians are actually under Latin rule after 1204, this is also a diplomatic issue. What right does somebody have to capture the subjects of another ruler? The last chapter considers the relations with Turkish Muslims. Now, chapter 1 is primarily about Asia Minor. Chapter 6 takes the story on to the conquest of the Balkans. As mentioned, the church is taking on a more and more important role, but of course, because of Muslim Turkish rule, quite a lot of bishops actually choose to remain in Constantinople, where their life is far more comfortable, which means that there's not the same possibility of helping captives. So this is a major problem in the redemption mechanism. There is some evidence for domestic and palace-based slavery of Greek Christians in Turkish Asia Minor, but because we don't have anything like the Latin archival documents for the Turkish world, there's a real problem of source imbalance and a real question of just how important that land trade was. When the Turks begin to expand in the Balkans in the sort of 14th century primarily, this is sort of decentralized raiding process rather than a centralized Ottoman conquest, such as would take shape later. And it comes with a lot of capture and depopulation. And what's interesting is that while the Latin evidence for the trafficking of Greeks to the west starts to dry up in about the sort of 1370s, 1380s, it continues very much in the Balkans in terms of what the Turkish groups are doing. And at this point, when we see the consolidation of conquest and repopulation through deportation of groups from one place to another, we see the emergence of the famous devshirme as the response, in my view, to a thinning pool of captives. You have to have a sort of levy system to take people in order to press them into military service because there simply aren't enough prisoners of war anymore. And this crisis of captivity really ends with the process of Ottoman consolidation in the later 15th century, but sporadic captivities certainly continue well into the early modern period, right up into the period of the Greek Revolution. I'd like to end with the map that's at the beginning of the book, which shows you the spread of captivities here. So the dark, the sort of fully colored area shows you the areas from which these captives came, which is pretty much what you would expect, the Southern Balkans, Western Asia Minor, according to the toponyms and the archival sources that I've identified. And then these checkered areas represent the places to which they were trafficked. And the closing comment would be that this, of course, demonstrates that while the Paleologan Empire itself is tiny and for much of this period restricted to a very small area of Thrace and southern Greece, the world that this crisis of captivity creates is truly pan-Mediterranean. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alasdair. A really good summary of what is an excellent book. Yeah, so time for questions. We've already have one question which has three parts, so I'll just start by reading that out. And if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to add them to the chat box or the Q&A box. So this is from Theo Maridanos, and it says, question for Alasdair, on the Muslim side, was there a prescribed or recommended behaviour for slave owners? One, How, when, and why did the slave owner decide whether to give freedom to a slave? 2, if the slave owner converted to Islam or not, how important was this for his treatment or freedom? And 3, were slaves clearly goods that could be treated however you liked if you wanted? So, Alasdair.
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions. You see, I don't know nearly so much about the Muslim side for this period as I do for the Latin side. And then if you go earlier in the Middle Ages, because of how what I'm now working on, it's vice versa, and I know much more about the Muslim side. So it's question two, I can definitely answer, which is that conversion is seen as a prerequisite for manumission, but conversion doesn't automatically lead to manumission. So you have to do it, but it doesn't give you any guarantees. So that's something that's certainly important, and something that's in parallel basically with the Christian story as well. So conversion is expected under Christianity, but there's often a very long delay before manumission comes. How and why did the slave owner decide whether to give freedom to a slave? Certainly in the Byzantine and Latin sources, because I mean, I must stress that for this period, in terms of sources written by Muslims, it's just so little. It's basically Al-Umari, Ibn Battuta, and the Distan of about Umar Pasha. So we've got sort of three sources, and I just don't have this level of depth on this. But what I do know from the Christian side is a lot of this is to do with people contemplating the fact that they're about to die and thinking that it would be a meritorious act to manumit that person, which shows that although basically a movement of an abolitionary movement is never contemplated. Nevertheless, there's a lot of emphasis on freeing enslaved people as a meritorious act. Were slaves clearly goods that could be treated however you liked if you wanted? So I guess the crucial point here is that this is a different sort of setting from the antebellum American South, or from, for example, 19th century Brazil. And one of the big differences is that basically anyone is a valid target for enslavement under the sort of ethical model that exists in the later medieval period. And so, on the whole, what I would say is that things look very different. Chances of manumission appear to me often in the context I research to be quite high. A lot of people, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, are getting manumitted during their own lifetimes. They're not dying enslaved. And whether that means that treatment is better, I don't know. I mean, you'll probably know there's this sort of apologetic narrative that's quite that has been recently questioned in a number of works about this idea that basically slavery in the Islamic world was very, very different because treatment was generally better, for example, than in the Christian world. I'm no expert for the 19th century context, so I wouldn't compare there, but basically in the medieval period, it seems to me to be very similar between contexts. It's basically comparable. That's not a very adequate answer to any of your questions, but at least two, I hope it helps.
One more question now, actually, from Tim Greenwood, and we've got 2 minutes, so should have time for this. So Tim asks, did the presence of Greek slaves in northern Italy have any linguistic impact, or are Greek-speaking slaves invisible?
Oh, that is a very interesting question. And of course, one of the really notable things about this whole phenomenon is that it hasn't effectively left any traces that are perceived to have political resonance today. So this is another way in which it differs substantially from the Americas, because these people are not perceived to be visible at all anymore in these societies. And so I suppose to some extent this extends to language as well, in the sense that there's not this clear sense of all of these, because of course these are people who are also among many people from the Black Sea region who are enslaved. And something that I would point to is that in northern Italy there are also, of course, a lot of Greek-speaking institutions. You know, there's a consulate in Genoa that's representing Greeks and that's representing the interests of the army, but this is somebody who has an Italian name. In Venice, of course, is quite a substantial community of Greek speakers. So I wonder to what extent this is also all part of a bigger story of migration, some of it by choice, some of it forced. And of course, later on, as you know, this leads to this this migration by choice from the 15th century leads directly to this sort of transfer of humanism from the Byzantine, post-Byzantine world to Italy. How much it influences Italian, I don't know.
Okay, thanks so much, Alasdair. So according to my watch, that is 20 minutes. So I think that's probably all that we have time for. So thanks, Alasdair, for an excellent summary of what is a really brilliant book. And I hope everyone has a chance to take a look at it. I'd highly recommend it.